Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. Thank you everybody here, and welcome to our audience watching this streaming on the web. Really glad you could join us. My name is Bill Adair. I am the Knight Professor for the Practice of Journalism and Public Policy at Duke University in Durham, North Carolina in the United States. I'm also the creating editor of PolitiFact. PolitiFact, very much a product of many, many people. I happen to be the person who had the idea, and then lots of other great, talented people made it work and made it the interesting project that it's been. So great to be here. Today we're going to talk about a concept that I think a lot of people are familiar with, but they may not always call it structured journalism. And so this is a concept that several of us, Laura, Chris, and I in particular, and folks in the United States are trying to promote as much as we can. So we're glad that you're here, and we'll be happy to answer some questions at the end, and also to talk further after the session, if you'd like. Let me introduce our panel. We have Laura Amico from the Boston Globe and one of the creators of Homicide Watch. Chris Amico, Laura's husband, from Frontline, and also one of the co-creators of Homicide Watch. And Alexios Mantzarlis from Pagella, Politica, and Fact Check EU, who didn't know that he was practicing structured journalism until I told him. So that tells you we've got some explaining to do. So it is great to have everybody here, and so I thought what we'd do is start with a little bit of an overview to just make everybody familiar with some of the terms and to understand what structured journalism is. We go back and forth about what to call it. We've come up with the phrase structured journalism. It reimagines the news story and breaks it into component parts, giving more flexibility to the journalist and the reader. And that last part is really important. The idea that the structured journalism puts the reader in charge. And by going beyond the old way of telling stories and breaking journalism into its parts, you allow the reader to explore. And you allow them to satisfy their curiosity in different ways. And so it is a very empowering form of journalism. Just to give you an understanding of the basic concept, in structured journalism, each story, what we would think of in the old days as story, is like an entry in a database. It has many fields. And that allows the narrative, if you think of it as in a traditional way as having a narrative, and the characters to be described in different ways and reorganized by the reader. And it also allows sorting and tallying. And to me, this is the great power that many people haven't taken advantage of. So the great power of the web, the great power of mobile devices is the ability to use the computing power to reorganize things, to look things up, to sort and tally. And yet, it's always striking to me that here we are 15 or 20 years into the internet revolution, and our journalism is still largely being told the old way, the way that we have told stories for decades, with a headline and text. And so structured journalism goes beyond the headline and text and breaks it into its component parts. And as I said, it puts the reader in charge. So let me just show you quickly what I mean by this. So here is a traditional way of telling a story. This is a blog post from a great blog, a fact-checking organization called Fact Check EU. But it's a story told the old way with really just two fields of information. One data field is the headline, and the other data field is the article. And that's really all there is. And so if you want additional information about the organization that is being fact-checked here, about the race in Montana, about the nature of this claim about a program in the United States called Social Security, you have to basically search the old way, search the entire text of the story, and search the entire text of everything that is on this blog. That's not very effective, is it? So let's show you the new way. So in structured journalism, we break the journalism into much smaller data fields. So the person who made the statement, so this is a fact check from PolitiFact. And it's an article that fact checks a statement by Rick Perry, who is the governor of Texas. And in this particular statement was making a claim about immigration in the United States. So one data field is his name. Another data field is the statement. So this is the statement that is being fact checked. Another data field is the date that he said it. Another one is where he said it. Another one is the rating. So PolitiFact has researched this statement and come to the conclusion that this statement is not just false, but ridiculously false, which gets the lowest PolitiFact rating, pants on fire. So the rating, pants on fire, is a data field. The text of the story is a data field. The sources that PolitiFact used in researching this is a data field. And the subjects are data fields. And this is a little more sophisticated than just meta tags, in that if you click on any of the subjects, you would see a list of all fact checks involving that subject. So compare this to what you just saw. The old way, just 2 fields of data. The new way, there are 6, 7, 8, 9, 9 fields of data, and there are actually some more there that I haven't outlined. So what does that allow you to do? That allows you to reorganize, recombine, tell different kinds of stories because you have all this rich data. So moving on to the way that you present the journalism. So you can add it all up. So if you want to know how many true ratings does Rick Perry have, this makes that possible because it adds up all of the true ratings. And all of the other ratings that he's earned. And if you look at this, you can see Rick Perry's record on the Truth-O-Meter is kind of mediocre. 29% of his ratings are either false or pants on fire, which, given that only 28% are true or mostly true, that's not a particularly strong record for accuracy. But all this is possible because the journalism is structured. It also allows you to say, show me all of the pants on fire ratings for Rick Perry. And he happens to have a lot. So you can see them all here. And you can click on any of those and you can read the full articles. It also allows you to combine things by television network. So you can, if you wonder, are there more falsehoods on the Fox News channel than on CNN? You can look that up because of the way we structure our journalism. So here, as you can see, the Fox News channel has a lot of false ratings. So these are statements by people made on Fox. 40% false or pants on fire, a pretty remarkably high number. The only way that's possible is because of structured journalism. And you can compare Fox to CNN, and you can see that CNN's record for accuracy, this is by a product of PolitiFact called Pundit Fact, where they track the pundits. You can see that the pundits on Fox get a lot more false and pants on fire ratings than on CNN. And that is really valuable information when you look at those numbers. And that is empowering the reader to look those things up. Another way that structured journalism is used is to track a politician's promises. So this is the Rouhani meter, which is done in tracking the promises of President Rouhani in Iran. And you can see this is a great way to use structured journalism. So what they have done is tracked President Rouhani's promises, 73 of them, and you can see the tally there, 8 achieved, 27 in progress, 5 not achieved, and 33 inactive. That is possible because of structured journalism. If you click further, you can see a sampling of some of the ones that have been rated recently and see how they're rated, and then you can click on any one of these and see here's a promise that is in progress, and the explanation of why it is. Finally, I want to just talk about a couple of projects that I'm doing at Duke with my students. Rule 46 is a structured journalism site where we are tracking athletes who have been charged with crimes. This is an idea from one of my students, Ryan Horger, and it is a demonstration project that we're doing just to explore, can you cover crime using a structured journalism site? And so we are focusing just on athletes who have been charged with crime, mostly pro athletes, but also college athletes. And our goal is to allow readers to see crime news in different ways. And this is a prototype of our homepage that you can see. Unfortunately, we don't have the site quite built yet, but hopefully we hope to have something up in the next couple of weeks. The name Rule 46 comes from a rule in the National Hockey League against fighting. And so we thought that would be a fun name for the site. And the idea is structured journalism to track the news about crimes. I've also got a project we're hoping to do this summer called Structured Stories NYC. And this is a idea of David Caswell, who is a former Yahoo engineer who started Structured Stories, a really cool project. I'm going to show you a screen from that in a minute. And his idea is to use structured journalism to cover local government. So assuming we can get a grant for this, we're going to send some Duke students to cover the New York City government and write updates for our website for Structured Stories NYC, which David has created. And they'll be covering City Hall and politicians and assorted controversies in New York. And just to give you a sense of what David has done in many ways is, like a scientist, he has gone to the atomic level to break journalism down to a tiny level. And this is, I'm going to show you this is a demo that he's done of the story of Little Red Riding Hood. And when you break it down like this and you realize that everything here is clickable and you can explore everything about Little Red Riding Hood or everything about the wolf, you begin to see the power of this. That this is about taking information and combining it in helpful ways that let the reader explore everything they want to know about the wolf. And it is really cool, and so we're really looking forward to working with him. If you want to see more, that's his site there, and the Little Red Riding Hood demo is under his Fun Stories tab. So with that, I will turn it over to Laura, who can talk a little bit about Homicide Watch and what she's doing at the Boston Globe.
Yeah, thanks. If you could pull up slides, that'd be great. Thanks. The data part of this, I think, is really interesting, and I hadn't seen Bill's slides before, but that part where he broke the story down on PolitiFact to all of the different parts, that is really what got me thinking about doing crime reporting and homicide reporting differently in particular. As a young reporter, it always frustrated me, like many, that I would fill up notebooks and notebooks and notebooks full of what I was learning when I was out on interviews, and only a fraction of that would make it into the story that was published. It also frustrated me that the conversations about crime that I was having with the police, that I was having with people in the neighborhood when I was out on the beat, that those were about really simple questions. Who was killed, was hurt? Who was arrested? Who responded? What were they charged with? What was the outcome? And that those really basic questions were informing not only how the community, but how the police also responding to those communities were understanding the impact of crime in the neighborhoods. And those were the notes that were inevitably left in my notebook that didn't make it into stories because we didn't have that longer arc to help us explain over time the connections between what was similar from one case to the next, and even more interestingly, what was different from one case to the next. This is the problem that I brought when I started Homicide Watch DC with Chris. We had recently moved to Washington, DC from California. And on my walk to the metro every day, I would pass by different memorials to those who had been killed in my neighborhood. And I wanted to sit down and really talk with my neighbors and those in my community about those questions, about those memorials. Who is this affecting? Who was killed? Who are the family members? Who was arrested? What were they charged with? And what was the outcome? That's the structure of Homicide Watch. And it's a structure that allows the community to then come into the story, answering those questions, and then make sense of it on their own and share how they're making sense of it with those around them. And that's the part that's really important to what makes structured journalism work, that it creates a framework for us all to say, we understand that these are the facts, that these are the data points, and this is the space we occupy because of that. And then we share with each other in that space. Homicide Watch worked in DC. We have about 500,000 page views a month on average, and roughly 6 minutes time on site. We did all of this covering every single homicide in the city with 1.25 reporters. So when we're looking at metrics for news and how people are using news, what we see is that the numbers support this type of journalism. There's an example of Homicide Watch right there. Because it worked in DC, Chris and I then tried to spread the idea to other cities. And we have worked with partnerships with newsrooms and universities in Chicago, in Trenton, New Jersey, and in Boston to do other Homicide Watch sites. In Chicago, we work with the Sun-Times, in Trenton, New Jersey with the Trentonian, and in Boston with Northeastern University. About 6 months ago, I joined the Boston Globe because I wanted to see, in part, if this idea of structured journalism would work within a traditional legacy newsroom. And in many respects, the Boston Globe is a traditional legacy newsroom. I've learned that there can be incredible success, but there are also incredible challenges. And I'm going to share a little bit, mostly about the challenges with you, because I think that that is the most interesting. I'm going to go to the other Chicago. Here, my first project, really, my first big project with the Globe, was preparing our coverage for the Boston Marathon bombing trial, which is, of course, still ongoing. It just entered its second phase. This is a big story, particularly for Boston, and there's a lot of interest in this. But I also knew that there's a lot that people don't know, one, about the case. Two, I know that people bring a lot of emotion into this. Much of Boston was either at the marathon when the bombings happened, they're connected to people who were there, whether or not they were hurt. The Marathon Day is a big day for our community. It's really the first day of spring. And so this is something that people care about a lot. Because it is a topic so full of emotion, it's difficult sometimes to find an entry point. And so what we created on these timelines is a sense of structure to say, if you're just coming into this today, here's the structure, here's how we describe the space, and here's where you fit into it right now. What you're seeing here on this slide is day 13 of an interactive timeline. And that day 13, that's our first piece of structure that we see. If you navigate forward or backwards with those arrows, you'll go to day 12 or day 14. It tells you after that what phase of the trial this is in. In this case, it's with the prosecution, and we're hearing testimony. On another day, you might see defense testimony, or prosecution opening statements, or later, defense closing statements. Below that, we have the date, because court doesn't sit every day, and we're interested in the ebb and flow of how this trial is happening. Next to that, we have a podcast that we're doing in partnership with WBUR, and this is more of a piece of content than structure, but because it has the structure around it, we're seeing people, again, spending a lot of time listening to these podcasts on a non-traditional listening space, and I think that's really been a success for us. Below that, we have the story of the day. Now, the Boston Globe is generating a lot of stories about the Marathon bombing trial, several stories a day. And what we're saying with the structure of this card is, if you read just one thing today, this is the thing that you need to understand what's happening. Below that, we have a structure of witnesses and exhibits. And if you click on witnesses, you see the names of the witnesses who testified that day. If you click on exhibits, you see the titles of the exhibits that were entered into evidence that day. The structure that these two things provide is telling you the pace of that day's trial. There are some days that we see just one or two witnesses. Others, we've seen as many as 15, 16, 17. The same goes for exhibits. There are some days where the physical evidence that is brought into court is overwhelming. And we see 25, 30, 40 exhibits on those days. Other days, we see the prosecution or the defense spending a lot of time with just one really important element. And so that signals to the reader that this is maybe something that if you're looking for more information, you should spend time on and look at. Again, because these cards stack over time into a timeline, what we see is users navigating forwards and backwards, understanding the rhythm and flow of how the trial is progressing. The second thing we've done is something that I think is interesting, but I'm still trying to decide whether or not it's a success. And this has a lot of the hallmarks of structured journalism, but I think misses the mark in some respects. This is a network of the witnesses and evidence in the case. So where I just showed you on that timeline card, when you click on witnesses, you see those names. If you click on a name, for example, Karen McWaters, it takes you to this page. And you see a data story around her, her name, her photo, her role in the case. That is why she testified. In this case, it's because she was a spectator at the marathon. We have a little biography about her, who she testified for, whether she was called by the prosecution or the defense, which day of the trial, and which exhibits she testified to. That is, which exhibits were entered into testimony because she was there. And then a link over to a story about her from the Boston Globe. Now, if you were to click on one of those exhibits, you would see the same sort of card but flipped. You would see the title of the exhibit, a little bit about it, a photo of it, whether it was from the prosecution or defense, and the day of trial that it came in on, and who testified to it. I really love this as a structure for trials, because what I struggle with in trials is how things build momentum over time. And the trial narrative is a non-linear narrative. An attorney will take a piece from a day here and a piece from a day there. And it's up to the jury at the end of the trial to figure out how it all fits together. Now, a good attorney makes that very easy. But when you're sitting in the courtroom and taking notes, it can be difficult to know that one piece of evidence or one witness is important without knowing what's going to follow it. And so the problem that we're trying to solve with this is creating a full body by which you can come in on one person and then begin to explore the structure of how the case is being built. I'll go quickly through the challenges that we've faced here. Okay, I'll go to starting points. Let's come back to that in questions. I think that the challenges are more interesting. The first is using constraints. Now, those cards are really small. They're actually, I showed you the big one, but they're actually designed specifically for mobile, so there's not much room on them. Bringing a legacy newsroom, or any newsroom at all, into such a constrained space has been very difficult. We see editors understanding those constraints differently, and when different editors are responsible for the cards on different days, we see them looking very differently, primarily in terms of which stories are selected as the main story of the day. But that's a conversation that I think we could have had earlier in the newsroom about how we were going to respond as a cohesive unit to those constraints. The second is using the right technology. All of what you just saw is running off of Google Sheets, which is a wonderful tool. Everybody has access to it. Everybody, for the most part, roughly understands how it works. The problem is that spreadsheets are really hard to edit, particularly when you're dealing with as much content as we're dealing with. And also because it's hard to get reporters to buy into the idea of taking notes within a spreadsheet. What makes the network work in particular is when reporters are taking notes during the course of the trial. And asking reporters to take notes in a spreadsheet is something that I've found as a very difficult cultural sell. I think that the network in part doesn't work as well as I'd like it to, because I don't know that we've followed our mission statement incredibly closely. I don't know if it tells a story at this point. There's a lot of data there and a lot of information, but I don't know what your pathway is through it once you look at a specific person or a piece of evidence and maybe follow a couple links. Finally, on workflow, and I mentioned this already, asking a reporter to report a story in data, as we're asking them to do, is very different from asking them to report a story in 800 or 1,200 words at the end of the day. That's something that takes a lot of prep, it takes a lot of practice, and going into a big story like the marathon trial is perhaps not the right time to try it out, although I think that we're seeing enough success that it's working. I will say that that network page that I'm expressing all of these concerns about does have a time on page of about 10 minutes, which is incredibly high for something that I worry about not having a story to. So these are things I'm struggling with and thinking about, and will be carrying into the next structured journalism project at the Boston Globe.
Thanks. All right, Chris.
So we pull up Ballot Watch, which is in the first tab in Firefox, all the way over on the left. And just make it big.
Great.
All right.
Whoops.
Where did it go?
Yeah, if you can make it full screen.
And what's the shortcut for that?
Right.
The square at the top right.
The square up there, next to the
It's
X,
Like, it's like you guys have a different word for everything.
right next to the red X.
There we go.
Yeah, all right. Yeah, good. Okay. So, back in 2013, the US Supreme Court overturned a 50-year-old law meant to make sure every American had the right to vote. It's called the Voting Rights Act. And the important thing about this law is that it meant that states with a history of discrimination couldn't change any of their voting laws without asking the federal government for permission. This was called preclearance. And when the Supreme Court overturned this part of the law, immediately states who had been previously prevented, began proposing and sometimes passing laws that would make it harder for some voters to cast ballots and easier for others. So this was a national story, but it was also a local story. And what started to happen is that I started to see headlines about a law being proposed in Georgia and passed in Pennsylvania, except that law got blocked by the courts. And the law in Alabama was passed but then vetoed. And then a law in North Carolina was passed but didn't go into effect for a couple of years. And so there was this general sense of lots of things are changing in lots of places, but it's really hard to keep track of what's actually happened, what has changed, what's still in progress, what didn't actually change. Like I said, national story, lots of local stories. It's a very fragmented environment. So I looked at this and I said, what I really need is a database. I need structure, and I need a beat. So I need two things. I need a database to keep track of what laws have passed in which states affecting which voters. And then I need some kind of narrative that tells me what's the direction of all of this? Where is this going? Who's pushing what? I needed a way to dig into this. So around that time, I had coffee with an editor at Frontline who was trying to hire a developer. And I said, I've got this idea. I really want to try and make this thing, I really want to try and find a better way to cover this long running battle for voting rights. And everybody seems to be struggling to do it. She said, well, as it happens, we have a reporter who's been trying to do the same thing. So I started, actually that was how I ended up working at Frontline, is they asked me to build this project, and this became Ballot Watch. So Ballot Watch is sort of a mini beat. It tracks changes to voting rights laws from 2010 to 2014, and it will track going into the next presidential election. And it tracks across 4 areas. Voter ID, which is the most sort of controversial thing, what ID you have to present when you go to the polls. Early voting, so how soon before election day as we call it, but it's now, in most states, you can vote much earlier, so it's not so much election day, but election month. So changes to early voting, changes to the rights of felons to vote. So if you've committed a crime, in some states you can't vote for some number of years, or in some states you can't ever vote again. And then absentee voting, so voting by mail. And these issues affect different voters in different ways, and so we wanted to track all 4 so that we could see who was being empowered and who was being disenfranchised. And what we wanted to make sure the user could do is see, how did we get here? How did we get to the place where we are now, where in your state you can vote, let's say, I'll take my state in Massachusetts where we live. You can't vote early, you can only vote on election day. You can vote, it's very hard to vote by mail, but you don't need any ID at the polls. And you can, and if you've committed a crime, you can't vote until, I think it's until you've completed all of your sentence and your probation and some period of time after. So how did we get there? What has actually changed? Because like I said, a lot of laws were passed or proposed but never went into effect, and some were overturned. And then how can we get past this big sort of national narrative and talk about really local changes and talk about specific laws that have been passed, specific changes, and who is actually being affected? So if you look at this, I'll show you just very quickly.
I love this page. This is so cool.
So this is all 4 of our issues. So go to
Start with
2010.
2010.
Yeah, so this is voter ID. This is the most controversial piece of it. I don't know how it works in other countries, but in the US, depending on which state you live in, you have to present a different kind of ID to vote. Like I said, in Massachusetts, you don't have to show any ID. You show up to the ballot, you say, my name is Chris Amico, I live at on this street, and they pull up your address, and they say, is this your address? And I say, yes. You sign your name next to it, and you go vote. It's easy. In other states, in a state like Texas, for example, you have to show a photo ID. So I'd have to show my driver's license, except my driver's license is from another state and maybe expired, because I don't have a car.
And if anyone's watching from the Massachusetts Highway Department, you know, don't arrest them.
I don't think it's expired, but it's fine. Like, I don't need it. I don't have a car. Yeah, I don't have a car, so I don't actually need a driver's license. I happen to have a passport, so I could vote with my passport. But lots of people don't have passports. Lots of people don't have any actual voter ID, or don't have any photo ID that they could use to vote. Lots of people don't live at the address on their ID. Lots of students, for example. And so this potentially limits a lot of people's ability to vote. In some states, you just need something with your name on it, like a credit card or like or a social security card. So this was in 2010. Not many states actually had a very strict voter ID policy. And then if you look at 2014, after the Voting Rights Act was overturned, suddenly you see this shift, and you see Georgia, Mississippi, Texas, and Virginia, along with Tennessee, Indiana, and Kansas, now require the strictest kind of ID. Photo ID is required in order to vote. Now, those states with a star next to it, Virginia, Texas, Mississippi, and Georgia, those were all prevented by the Voting Rights Act from actually implementing their laws until 2013, when the law was overturned. And you can see overall in this general shift towards a stricter requirement. If you look at, I think the other one that's interesting is absentee voting. So this, you see things going the other way. So now this is interesting as a pairing, because voter ID tends to affect disproportionately people who vote for Democrats. Young people, black voters, Latinos, working women, or women in general. Absentee ballots tend to be favored by voters who are older, whiter, and tend to vote for Republicans. What we saw in a lot of states was voter ID laws became stricter, so you needed more ID in order to vote. Absentee ballots became more available. It became easier to vote by mail, which made it easier for older, whiter voters to vote. And we saw this. This was sort of a thing that a storyline that kept coming up. We said we need to be able to verify this, and we were able to verify it through collecting this data and showing how these laws had changed in which states and on which issues.
Want to go to concussion watch, or?
Let me just talk about what's next. So this had a lot of successes, but this was very much a first iteration. We did this in the run-up to the 2014 election, which was a midterm. We have another election coming up. Some of you may have heard about it. Some people with familiar names running. So the next thing we need to figure out how to do is, how do we cover this over 6 years? How do we cover this? And then how do we create more ways for people to participate? How do we let people report on what's happening at their polling place? Or how do we show how this is actually affecting people on an individual level? And then how do we actually test the impact of these laws? Because that's one of the big open questions is, to what degree does a stricter voter ID law actually depress voting? Or how much does allowing more early voting expand voting? Or expanded absentee ballots, how much does that expand voting? And we haven't checked that yet. There hasn't been good data yet, but we're hoping we can do that in the for the next election.
All right, we only got about 15 minutes left.
Okay.
So if you wanna,
Yeah.
why don't we go to Alexios, and then that way we got time for questions.
Yeah.
Do you mind putting up, there's the PowerPoint on the desktop, I think.
While Bill does that, I will tell you guys that we have a structured journalism Google group where we're sharing a lot of the lessons learned. It's us and a bunch of other people who are also working on these projects. we'd love to see more people in that group, and we will share that on the IJF Twitter and Facebook and all those other groups so that you know how to join.
Great.
Thank you. So hello. I am one of the co-founders of Pagella Politica, which is Italy's leading fact-checking website, as well as FactCheck EU, which is our European crowd-driven fact-checking spin-off. So when Bill asked me to participate in a panel on structured journalism, I said, sure, cool. And then right after I asked him what the hell structured journalism was. So this is not to say anything about Bill's panel convening capacities, as much as to say that for many of us, and I'm thinking especially those of us who haven't come from a classic traditional journalistic background, structure is actually how we think to put up certain projects. And it was definitely what we did, both at Pagella Politica and at FactCheck EU. So we use it on the front end. I'll just make a brief example. This is on factcheckeu.org. We have a map of Europe, and the pins are various statements we have fact-checked or that we are fact-checking. The colors, so on the right you can click and choose, whether you want much like with PolitiFact, whether you want the truer statements or the falser statements. What this does is it frees, or at least it provides another channel for your readers that isn't the chronological one. It allows them to browse your content in a way that isn't newest first. And this helps when you have a website like ours that isn't plugged into the news cycle necessarily, because a fact check takes longer to write than maybe so-and-so said this. I don't know whether it's true or not. So the other thing this does, which is convenient for traffic, is that if you have in one cute little widget all your content, other websites are happy to carry it. And we've had about a dozen websites across Europe carrying this widget, and that does help. What I really wanted to talk about briefly, though, is how structure has helped Pagella Politica in our backend. In two ways. One, it has freed up work from I want to call it newsroom, but it's, mostly volunteers and two people who are paid, so whatever that is. But we have a system that helps us find all the statements that are made by certain politicians, the politicians we follow, through RSS feeds, through YouTube, through Twitter, and that clears up a lot of work that normally someone who manually goes through the news would do. So this helps us a lot. When we do go through the feeds or the YouTube videos or whatever that it is that we find, we categorize them. We either create the statement that you will fact check, because you can fact check some statements and you can't others. But what I really want to explain here is that we also categorize everything else. So instead of just clicking bin to a statement that you read and therefore spent time on, you archive it as something or other, as a political judgment, more interestingly, as a prediction, as a promise. What this does is the work you've put in anyway, you are storing somewhere that you can do something with. And these are stories in the coming, stories that can happen actually, because if 2-3 months down the line you hear someone saying something, or a politician makes promises, makes predictions all the time, you can actually go back and see what did Matteo Renzi promise or predict at the beginning of his term, and what has he actually done now. So that helps.
That is really cool.
Thanks. What this also does is that if you've stored all these statements, and we are now in our 2.5 years that we've been working and that we've had this running, we have stored 200,000 statements. Not big part of them are, because much of it is keyword related, big part of it is maybe, photo galleries on gossip on Renzi or something like that, so that's useless. But a good 100,000 or so are stories that, statements of politicians that we've isolated, and this allows us to research in specific time frames how certain statements, how certain topics were trending, so to speak, in the politician leaders that we follow. So for example, these were the first 100 days of the Renzi government. It started talking a lot of electoral law reform, a lot of school, a lot of jobs. And then as we got closer to the European elections, taxation came up. And I mean, any one of you who's familiar with Italian politics, it was, you know, the 80 euro bonus. It was, so this kind of makes sense, just, you know, by stomach-wise. We haven't really made much use of this because we're a fact-checking organization. We don't write much story about discourse. But we have been talking with magazines and researchers about how they could, you know, find uses to this stuff. Yeah, so the final thing we're doing, and this is interesting in terms of more closer to our product and closer to our business model, in fact, is we've been structuring our data. And by our data, I mean our sources. So every fact check we write, if there is a source that is cited or mentioned, we will hyperlink to it. And when you hyperlink to it, the RCMS, our backend, forces you to do a certain amount of things to it. It forces you to say which is the source, when was it updated, what's the title. And more we're hoping to be able to transform this data, which often is in, I was saying this yesterday, so anyone who was there, please excuse me, but especially in Italy, some of the data is in absolutely useless format to actually use later. No, you know, PDFs, JPEGs, you know, like just stuff that you, and if we convert it through Google Sheets, through Google Excels into something that is then all coherent, we are hoping to provide a software, a service to journalists who can go on this search engine, know that our 10,000 data sets are much better than what you would find with a random Google search because they have been certified, they've been used by fact checkers who do this for a living, and can actually extract this data and make something out of it. So I thought I'd give a bit of a different perspective in the sense of what it can do for you as much as what it can do also for the story. One challenge that we have found is that so structure is great, and I love our CMS in many ways. I detest it in others. And once you have a CMS that works in a certain way, I don't have an accurate metaphor, but it's really difficult to change it. So have a long thought when you're structuring the back end of your website in a way that is going to be most useful for you. Get consultancy from experts of, you know, if we had the time, the money, the expertise at the time, we would have gotten to, yes? CMS is? Content management system, right? Yeah. Yeah. So it's like how you put in things in your back end to publish the article.
If I want to make a comment, all you have been talking about is like building a database. So what you're saying, when you build a database, you need to think of the structure of your database, because then you want to have tables that can talk one to the other. So when I was seeing your presentation, it looked like you're building a database for stories. So what you're saying now is...
Yeah, I think you're building the interface.
Straightforward, that you need to think of the structure before...
Yeah. No, but what I'm saying is that when they... And I promise I didn't think I was saying anything intelligent, but it's a question of once you have it like that, once you've categorized 10,000 data sets and 200,000 statements, you are not going to want to change it entirely, and then suddenly everything you have in the back can't speak to everything that you have now. So, you know, or you have to then go back manually and, you know, change 200,000 data sets. So yeah, absolutely, you need to spend a lot of time.
The holy grail that I think we're looking for now, is a CMS, a technology answer that allows enough structure to do these projects easily and simply, but enough flexibility that no matter what beat you're covering or what your questions are, you can build that CMS easily. And that's in part why we're having this conversation, a large part of why we have the Google group, because there are lots of answers out there, and we're looking to gather those as best we can. If you have any, if you're working on this, we'd love to hear from you.
And Chris, could you get to work building that flexible CMS that'll work for everybody?
On it. Yeah, so this is actually raises a really good issue because a lot of what we've talked about is there's sort of two ends of this spectrum. There are structured beats and projects that are sites in and of themselves. And then there are things that are projects and that are temporary. So something like PolitiFact, Homicide Watch, Pagella, Politico, Politica, Vox, Circa. These are sites, these are businesses. They have a life, they're full stack. You build something and that's all you use. It's not part of a larger site. And then we have things like the marathon bombing trial, Ballot Watch to some degree, or some of my other projects at Frontline, which are somewhat transitory. We build something, we build the site we need or the tools we need for a project that lasts maybe 6 months, and then we move on. And that has a very different sort of, that has a different technology need than something that you're gonna use for years. So that's a lot of what I've been thinking about lately. It's, in some ways it's comparing, are you building a city, or are you building a skyscraper, or are you building a tent city? Are you building a campground? A campground is nice because you can set it up in a day, and then when you're done, you just pack it up and you go home. But you don't want to live in that for years.
We have a
But
question.
let me just comment on that. We'll get to the question. So I think one key, and you hit on it, Alexios, which is that when you build your CMS, you should always give yourself one big kind of sweeping, flexible thing. And that we realized when we were doing the sports crime website is, what if we see a trend? What if we see that football players are more likely to be involved in domestic abuse cases? How can we tell a reader of that? Well, if you have too much structure, like you were saying, there's no way to do that. So the solution is actually pretty simple, and that is to always give yourself a flexible option that is just an article. So we did this in PolitiFact, that at the top of every PolitiFact homepage is article, and an article can be anything from hey, we've noticed there are a lot of pants on fires coming out of Texas. What is it with Texas? Or hey, we've compared the cable networks and here's how they compare. And so you always want to have that flexibility. Question? Yeah. Oh.
You just said if you have a tool that does this data structure management, and that's also where you can change the data structure. We actually built that exactly for the kind of use cases you described. So it's called detective.io. It's open source. You can download it. It's basically just a Neo4j database, and you have a layer in between that lets you create any kind of API to work on your structured data.
Can you give the name again?
Detective.io.
Great.
I'm curious what made you, what you were thinking about when you created that.
Well, we did that for a project we did, which is called Migrants Files, where we structured the data about all the migrants who die trying to come or stay in Europe. And because we needed it for one investigation, we tried to make it reusable. So yeah, that's what we did.
And that was a brilliant project. If you guys haven't seen it, really do check it
Thank
out.
you.
It was beautiful. We have another question in the front. If you'd wait for the mic.
I'm a data journalist, but I work in developing countries. And in a lot of countries, there's really great fact-checking groups they're NGOs or think tanks that have all this structured data. And I can't for the life of me figure out how to get them involved in legacy media. Because the legacy media, sometimes they can't even handle an embed code. And it's like, so there's all this fantastic, budget transparency data. There's basically they have a PolitiFact in Turkey. They have a whole budget transparency thing in Kenya. And I can't figure out, workshops haven't worked. Bringing them together and look what a great tool it is. That doesn't work. So I'm kind of wondering, and something Chris just said, would it be better to start with a micro project? Let's, it's just, I don't know, changing the Boston Globe is one thing, but try the nation of Kenya.
Yeah, so I love projects. For a long time, I always wanted to build, Homicide Watch was sort of the peak of something I'd wanted to build for a long time. And it happened to work out that Laura really wanted to do that reporting, and I really wanted to build that site. and we happen to be married. So that all came together at just the right time. And it's great, but it was, we ran Homicide Watch DC for 5 years, and you don't want to take 5 years to prove an idea. So I really like sort of these pop-up projects that can be spun up very quickly. You can stick with them for a long time, for a couple of months, say 6 months or 3 months, or maybe even a month. Maybe it's shorter, and then if it doesn't work, wind them down. And so I've been trying to find ways to build things using what are called static site generators. So things like Tarbell or Jekyll, or there's more tools for it. Things that will take a spreadsheet or a database and some templates and maybe pull in a bunch of different sources of data, and you just spin up a little website that can live on Amazon S3, so it costs you effectively nothing to host it. And doing those, it's easier to convince a news organization to say, like, look, let's just set this up, we'll put it on a subdomain, you can point some traffic at it, but once you're done with it, it won't cost you lots of money to maintain it. Like, if you're still gonna run this for 2-3 years, like, let's talk about building something more permanent. But if it's just like a little test project, like Ballot Watch is built like this, because I didn't know if Frontline was going to take it and run it for a month, or make it a 3-year project. And it's sort of in a transition phase right now.
And I think, so being from the fact-checking world, I can relate totally, and I know the cultural resistance that you get for any kind of new idea that, particularly one where reporters and editors are reluctant to go as far as to say this statement is false. But even with some of my colleagues at the St. Petersburg Times, now the Tampa Bay Times, who were initially didn't know what to make of fact-checking, they eventually really came to support it. And so it just takes a while. I know in Africa Check is doing some great work to try to get people to understand fact-checking and to get more fact-checking in different countries. And Alexios has run into this, and the way that you've dealt with it is by just relentless, marketing, and Alexios always has a million ideas, and he's pursuing them all. And
you're calling me a pain in the neck, Bill. I'll take that.
Yes, in a good way, Alexios. So I just think you just keep trying, and eventually people come around. So we probably got time for 1 or 2 more questions. Over here? Yes.
And oh my God, and it's terrible. I apologize for my English, but this is what I can say. I heard Laura last year or 2 years ago, I cannot remember, and I was very impressed by Homicide Watch, and I started looking at her work, at your work in general, and then it took some time to think about. And now, after a year, I have some questions. First is, which difference you feel there is between your work and sociology or anthropology? You call it journalism, but to me, it's not easy to understand.
That's a terrific question. I actually majored in anthropology in college, so I think that is a large part of what I do bring to journalism. That's really interesting.
Sorry, the second part was about your presentation you did about poll and voting system in US, which is quite exotic for an Italian, because for us it's not possible to walk without an ID. It's forbidden. If one of that men with the hat stop you without an ID, you can be bring in jail in Italy, so don't forget it. So when you put this color, you were anyway communicating something. For you, green is movement. I think it's free. For us, is something is not allowed. So even in data, there is an interpretation and the story. So this is my, not question, but somehow I want to pick you.
Yeah, so we struggled a lot with the colors on the site, and actually I'll criticize it even further and say that if you're colorblind, it's a big problem because a lot of it is red and green, and we actually went with, in the US it's a stoplight, so red, yellow, green, and we wanted to keep, I think we mostly kept it in that order, except I think one place we broke it. But we said if we're gonna use those colors, we need to at least think about how people, we need to give some other indication of what we're saying. We need to communicate through position or through movement or through size or just plain text what we're saying. So I think it is, one of the things you have to think about with these sites is that you're communicating in a lot more ways than just your text, just your articles. So think about color, layout, position, all of it, shapes. Because it's a good point. There's lots of different pieces of this that are communicating than just what we say.
So I was just looking, if you want to join our structured journalism Google group, is the URL, that's the email address. What is the URL? Do you know it offhand?
Groups.google.com/structured journalism, something like that.
Groups.google.com/ what is it with this keyboard?
You're all witnessing Bill's first encounter with an Italian keyboard.
Structure, is it hyphenated?
Yes.
Okay, I think that's it, and that'll get you to our discussions, and I think you can sign up directly there. Well, we're close.
Thank you guys all so much for coming,
Yeah.
and we look forward to continuing this conversation even more.
If you can't find the Google group, just you can email me, bill.adair@duke.edu, and
we'll share it on Twitter.
Yeah. Yes. Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.